Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction on inputs and outputs in Python. So inputs and outputs basically, let's start with an input. This is taking user input, someone who is running your code, the user interface. They are the ones that are entering the values that you'll be working with. That is user input. Output is just outputting anything into the terminal, whether it is user input or whether it is your own thing that you are outputting into the terminal. So to start with input, in Python, user input is very simple. It's just under input, and then within input, you can enter any sort of string of something you want to prompt a user with. So we can say enter your name. So now, if we were to run this, it would say enter your name, to which we can, any value of our likings. I'm just going to do my name. And as you can see, we've entered our name, but doesn't really do anything with the name because we haven't really done anything with this input statement. We've kind of just stated it. So in an earlier tutorial, I've introduced variables. So what we can do is, and also just a quick recap, variables hold information or data in memory. So what we can do is we can actually put this input statement into a variable. So for example, we can use a variable name, and name could actually equal this input statement. So what will happen is that this is what will be displayed to the user, and whatever the user inputs as a value of this input is what will be held in memory for the variable name. So in this situation, if we were to have name over here and we put Faison, the name Faison would be held under name. So now what we can do is we can run this code, and it says enter your name, so we can put the name Faison. And now it still hasn't done anything, but we've made a step, and now this name Faison is actually stored in memory rather than just typed and forgotten about. So now this variable name holds the value of Faison that I put into this input statement. So now moving on to output. Output in Python is also very simple. It's just the one print function that Python has. So what you can do in a print function is you just do print bracket, and then in quotations you could just put any text that you want to output to the terminal. So we can put this is a sample text. So if we were to run this code, we first have our input. We could put the same name. It would be my name, Faison. And then it would just print this as a sample text because we printed output. Now, this is how you print any sort of output to the screen. But say we want to output what we put in for name. So we've inputted our name, and we want to output this name that we've inputted to the screen. What we can do is, through this print statement, we can actually output the value that's now stored in name. So if we do print name, so then whatever we input over here will be stored in this variable, and we can actually output whatever is stored in this variable by using the print function. So now if we were to run this code, we can enter the same name, and I want you guys to just, before I press enter, I just want you to guess what it's going to output. So if you guess correctly, it just outputs our name because the variable name holds this value in memory, which is my name. So then when we print it and we output it, it'll just output this value. So that's a pretty quick and brief introduction to inputs and outputs in Python. They can actually be used with any sort of data type, whether it's floats, integers, or strings. If you do want to make the user input into an integer, if you want to perform, say, for arithmetic operations, you would actually have to use casting. So you have to cast. So any input by default would become a string. So if you want the user input to be an integer, you would have to cast it to an integer, which you can use the int function. Likewise, if you would like it to be a float value, if you want the user maybe enter a decimal number, you would do the float method. So what we can do is we actually just take this and wrap it around the input statement, and it would turn the name from a string into an integer or into a float. So if we were to do int and then input, and we were to run this program, say just for example, if I were to enter a string like Faison, which is just letters and not numerical, and we were to actually press enter, you would get an error because it's not an integer. It's a string, and we want the user to input an integer. This can be useful for performing arithmetic operations. Likewise with the float, they both hold the same value. And also you can notice if you were to put in 63.1, if you were to put in a decimal number and run it, it also wouldn't work because integer is a whole number that doesn't hold a decimal, so it has to be a whole number. And now if we were to we're just going to also print it out just to prove that it's being held in the variable name. So now if we were to put any type of integer, say like 64, it'll output 64 because 64 is an integer, and we've gotten the correct input from a user that we can use towards things like arithmetic operations or anything that involves integers. Likewise for floats, we can do the same thing as well, and by default, input is always string. Basic calculator system where we're going to take two integers from the user and we're going to output a arithmetic operation. So we can do int1, which we can make any sort of, we want the user to input an integer, so what we can do is we can wrap it in int, and we can do input, please enter an integer value. So what we are doing here is we are asking the user for an integer value. We're storing it of the data type integer, and we're storing it in this variable int1. So now what we are also going to do is take another integer from the user so we can then perform arithmetic operations. So we can do int2 equals int input, please enter another integer value. So now what we are doing here is we're taking two integers from the user, and we want to perform some sort of arithmetic operation using these two integers. So what we can do is we'll just try adding. So we'll make final, what we can do is we can do int1 plus int2. So it's taking the user input for this integer and the user input for this integer, and it's adding the two of them together and storing it in the variable final. So now what we can do is we can print the result is, and if you want to print variables in your print statements, you can use a plus and to concatenate it. So you can add final using the plus, and you can also, since it's an integer, it's a better idea to use a comma, which automatically adds space. So what we can do is after a quotation, we can add a comma, space, and then we can do final. So what this will do is to say the result is comma final. So over here, the comma would work and the plus wouldn't because it is not a string that we're doing it, rather it's an integer. So we aren't concatenating it, so a plus sign would not work. Rather, we'd have to use a comma, which is the same for float as well. So what this will do is it'll print the result of the two integers that we prompt the user for, that are stored as integer values because we are performing arithmetic operations once more. So now if we were to run this code, please enter an integer value. We can enter 64, and then we can add 8. So another integer value would be 8. So it'll compute the result, which is 64 plus 8, which equals to 72. And the same can be done if we were to cast this to a float, and float again, and we were to enter integer value. Now we'd have to enter a float value, sorry, not an integer value. Let's just avoid confusion by changing that within our input statement. Please enter a float value. And then now we can enter a decimal value. So if we do 5.5, and then we can do 6.3, and the result final would be stored as a float value by the addition of these two variables, and it'll end up giving us 11.8. And the same can be done whether you want to do subtraction. You can use a subtract, you can multiply using the asterisk, and you can divide using the plus, and these can all be done. These are the arithmetic operations that can be done in Python, along with things like modulus or floor division. But yeah, that's just a very simple calculator program that asks the user for input and computes arithmetic operation as a result and displays it to the user using output. What we can do is we can just do a personalized greeting. We can ask the user for their name and their age, and then we can output their name and age in a greeting for them. So what we can do is we can do first name, and make sure we use camel casing as a good variable convention. And then we can make this variable as an input, and by default it'll be a string because their name would be containing characters, which would be a string. We don't have to really perform arithmetic operations or anything numerical with it, so we could just have it as a string. So we could do enter your first name, and then prompt the user for the first name. And then we can do age, and this, because we're asking for a number, and age can't really be a decimal, we're going to store it as an integer value. So we can do int input, please enter your age. So now we have the person's first name, or the user's first name, stored in the variable first name, and their age stored in the variable age, respectively. And this would be held as an integer because age would be an integer value, non-decimal, and this would be held as a string because your name would be containing letters, which is a string. So now we can print sort of a greeting or a introduction to the user. So you could say, hello, my name is, and then here we can use the plus operator because we're concatenating a string, and then you could do first name, and then you can also use the plus again if you want to add more text, and you could say, and I am, and then over here we'd have to use a comma because it's an integer, so we can't really concatenate, so we could say I am age, and then we can use a comma again, and then text again, and then we could say years old. So over here we can use a plus and use concatenation because first name is a string. Over here, because age is an integer, we cannot use the plus sign because we're not concatenating. So what we do have to do is end up using commas, which commas also automatically add a space. So as you can see over here, after is, I've added my own space because we're doing concatenation. And over here, maybe I should add a space as well. But over here, after the am, I'm not adding a space, or before the years old because these commas add a space for you. So now if we were to run this code, I just want you to maybe take a quick guess of if you were to put in your name and your age, what do you think would output here? So I'm just going to put first name, we'll do Bob, and let's say that Bob is 30 years old. So what it will say is you'll end up getting a greeting which is saying, hello, my name is Bob and I am 30 years old. So that's just a quick little personalized greeting, which is a very good exercise for inputs and outputs. I do encourage you to, do your own little practices, maybe do a little bit other arithmetic operations, take some other input from the user, output something else, just practice it on your own, get really good with this because user inputs and outputs are very important in the world of programming. Thank you so much for watching this quick introduction to input and output in Python, and I will see you in the next tutorial. As always, make sure to drop your questions and comments down below, and I'll be sure to answer. Thank you so much.